Witnesses and the sheriff looking unexpectedly solemn in a clean collar. Lydia married August Rourke in the front room of the main house with the windows shut against the cold and a pan of biscuits gone forgotten in the kitchen because nobody had remembered to take them out in time. It suited them better that way. There were no ribbons, no hired fiddler, no crowd pressing in to make a show of it. Jonah stood beside his mother in boots newly blacked and a vest Nels had traded 2 sacks of oats to acquire from a cousin in Laramie. He carried himself with such grave importance that even the pastor, a spare man not given to smiling during sacred business, had to pause once to gather himself before finishing the words. When it came time for August to answer, he did not speak loudly. He never had. But there was a steadiness in him now that had not been there the day he crossed the boardwalk in Cottonwood Crossing. Then, he had been a man doing what decency required. Now he was a man choosing, in front of God and whoever else cared to listen, the life he meant to keep. Lydia's answer came clear as bell metal. Afterward, Nell shook August's hand much too hard, then Lydia's more gently, because despite everything he still did not quite know what to do with women except give them the better chair and move out of their way when they were carrying something hot. Jonah accepted congratulations as if he had arranged the whole thing personally, and Patch, offended that so many people had gathered indoors without consulting him, barked twice and lay down squarely in the middle of the room where everyone had to step around him. The biscuits burned. Nobody cared. Winter came early that year, laying a hard glitter over the trough edges and turning the fields silver at dawn. The restored line along Willow Draw was set right before the first deep snow, this time with the county clerk present, the surveyor sober, and half the neighboring ranchers watching close enough to count each hammer blow. Nels planted the posts with both hands and no hesitation. When he was done, he stood back, wiped his palms on his coat, and looked older for a minute and freer too. August did not say he forgave him. Nels did not ask. Men sometimes preferred to build forgiveness out of weather and labor rather than words, and on the frontier that counted for something. Lydia brought ledgers into order the way some women brought lace out of thread, patiently, with exact fingers and an eye for pattern. By Christmas the bank note no longer lurked like a wolf in the corner of every conversation. There was still debt, because there was always debt somewhere in ranch country, if not in money then in favors, weather, or bone. But it had become a thing to be worked on, not feared. That was a different burden entirely. She set up a proper school table by the window in the cabin for Jonah, and in the afternoons, once chores were done, she taught him sums and reading from an old McGuffey reader August's mother had once used. The boy took to reading with unexpected hunger. He frowned over each line as if language were a fence to be climbed one board at a time. Then all at once it gave way, and stories began to move through him. Some evenings August would come in from the cold and find Jonah by the stove sounding out a page to Patch, who listened with more patience than most men. The coat Lydia Talbot had left behind hung through that winter on a peg beside the cabin door. Lydia had washed and mended it, and could have put it away, but she did not. It remained there not as a shrine and not as a wound either, but as part of the shape of things. August never passed it carelessly. Once, in late January, she found him standing before it with one hand on the collar where the hidden seam had been. "He saved me twice," August said without turning. "Once in the Sweetwater mud, and once after he was gone." Lydia came to stand beside him. Then perhaps the second time was simply him finishing the first. August looked at her. "You have a way of making grief sit down instead of pace." "I've had practice." He bent and kissed her temple, and between them the old coat stirred slightly in the draft from the door, as if some last restless piece of sorrow had finally decided it could rest where it was. By spring, the cabin no longer felt borrowed. Lydia's blue crock sat on the shelf above the stove. Jonah's repaired wooden horse stood on the windowsill with 2 proper wheels now, thanks to Nels, who had carved the replacements on a night when the wind kept everybody indoors and claimed he was only tired of hearing the boy drag the crooked thing across the floor. A rag rug of Lydia's making lay by the bed. August's shaving mug appeared by the washstand more mornings than not, though he still made a point of knocking when he came in, as though love had only increased, not lessened, his respect for thresholds. That mattered to her more than he knew. People sometimes mistook rescue for ownership. August never did. He asked. He waited. He left room. And because he did, Lydia found herself giving freely what no demand would ever have won. In March, the raw-boned chestnut mare Jonah loved foaled in the lower barn during a sleet storm that rattled like dried peas on the roof. Something went wrong with the birth, and by the time August got there the mare was down and shivering, the foal half-delivered and failing. Nels was away with a stock buyer. One hand had ridden for the far pasture. There was no one to spare. August tied back his sleeves and went in without wasting a second. Lydia sent Jonah to heat water and hold the lantern. She steadied the mare's head and spoke into the wet velvet of one trembling ear while August worked with both arms red to the elbow and mud on his knees. The colt came at last in a rush of steam and blood and straw, ugly as forgiveness, and for a long, terrible half-minute did not breathe. Jonah knelt beside it, thin shoulders quivering with effort. "Come on," he whispered, as if coaxing a shy friend from behind a door. "Come on now." August cleared the nostrils, rubbed hard, breathed once into the small, dark muzzle, then struck the chest with the flat of his hand. The colt coughed. It was the smallest sound in the world, and it filled the whole barn. Jonah laughed then, a startled, bright sound, and Lydia turned to look at him because she had heard him laugh before, but never like that. Not with all the fear washed out of it. Not with no caution left at the edges. August heard it too. He sat back on his heels in the straw, exhausted and half-frozen, and smiled up at the boy in a way that made Jonah forget himself enough to throw both arms around his neck. This time the child did not go stiff when lifted or touched. He clung. Lydia turned away a little, pretending she needed to check the mare's flank and let the tears come if they wished. Some mercies deserved privacy even when they were witnessed. By the time the roads dried and meadowlarks returned to the fence lines, Cottonwood Crossing had adjusted its story. Towns always did. People who had once spoken Lydia Talbot's name with pity or suspicion now called her Mrs. Rourke and came to her for advice on preserving fruit, settling accounts, writing letters to grown sons in Montana or daughters in Omaha. She was not fooled by the change, but neither was she bitter enough to refuse the honest part of it. Communities mended the way ordinary quilts did, unevenly, from scraps, with old tears still visible if a body looked close. One afternoon in May, the hotel keeper from Pine House came riding out in a hired buggy with a jar of gooseberry jam in her lap and a look on her face like somebody swallowing medicine she herself had prescribed. Lydia saw her from the porch and very nearly went back inside out of pure mischief, but stayed where she was. The woman climbed down carefully. "Mrs. Rourke." "Mrs. Beecham." Mrs. Beecham held out the jar. "I made too much." Lydia accepted it because refusing would only prolong the woman's misery. That happens. There was a silence in which wind moved through the cottonwood leaves and a hen scratched industriously at the yard, as if human shame were none of her concern. At last Mrs. Beecham said, "I should not have turned you out like that. No, I believed what was easiest. That also happens." Mrs. Beecham looked relieved and disappointed all at once. "You could make this harder." "I know." Lydia set the jam on the porch rail. "But I have supper to start." The woman's shoulders lowered by a degree. She nodded once and took herself back to town carrying, perhaps, the first useful discomfort she had felt in years. If a listener had ever lived long enough to see the town's judgment change after the damage was already done, then that listener would know there was no triumph in it, only a kind of sober satisfaction. People often arrived at decency later than they ought. Still, late was better than never, and in hard country a person learned not to waste every second chance by demanding it arrive in perfect clothes. Summer found the ranch greener than it had any right to be. Willow Draw ran clear along the restored line, catching morning light in thin bright seams. Calves held steady. The south pasture recovered. August, with Lydia at his books and Nels on the range, hired back 2 hands and paid them on time. The place began to look less like a man enduring and more like a family building. That word had once sat awkwardly in Lydia's chest. It did not anymore. One evening near sundown, after a long day of branding and dust and men speaking more with nods than language, Lydia carried a plate of Jonah cake out to the fence where Jonah sat watching the chestnut colt buck foolishly in the pasture. He had shot up that summer in the way children do after safety settles into their bones. His wrists were still narrow, but they no longer looked breakable. He took the plate, then did not eat right away. "Ma," he said. "Yes." If Pa was here, would he mind? The question was so softly put that for a moment she thought the wind might have invented it. She sat beside him on the rail. Down in the yard, August was drawing water while Patch circled him for no reason other than habit and love. Nels laughed at something one of the hands said, and the sound carried clean in the evening air. No, Lydia said. I don't believe he would. Jonah watched August a while longer. I think he was lonely before we came. Lydia smiled a little. Children often saw straight through what adults wrapped in manners and silence. I think you may be right. Jonah nodded, satisfied by the confirmation more than the answer. Then he bit into the Jonah cake and, mouth half full, said, I was too. She put an arm around him. He leaned in without noticing he had done it. Years later, when people spoke of the Rourke place, they spoke of its horses first, or its water, or the accounts that always somehow came out right even in thin seasons. They spoke of August as fair and Lydia as steady and Jonah as the kind of young man who opened gates before being asked and listened longer than most. Few remembered the boardwalk scene with any accuracy. Fewer still remembered Virgil Sloane except as a warning. But on certain evenings, when the light turned honey-colored over the pasture and the cottonwood threw a long shade toward the cabin porch, an old story still lingered there if a person knew how to look. A woman once stepped off a bad road with a child and a broken trunk and believed she had come to the end of what the world would offer her. A man saw the child first. Then he made room. And that, more often than grand promises ever did, was how a life began again. If this story found a quiet place beside your evening, then perhaps it settled where it was meant to. And if somewhere beyond this porch light and pasture dusk there's a memory or a place this one stirred in you, it would not have surprised any of them to know it. Some stories are just company on the road. Others sit down and stay. At the last of the light, Jonah came running barefoot from the yard with the chestnut colt's halter in one hand and laughter still on him. And August turned at the well, while Lydia stood in the porch doorway with her dish towel over one shoulder, the lamp newly lit behind her, and the whole of home gathered in that single, ordinary frame.